So let's turn to Sara, please, to continue talking about the policy brief itself.
Yes, and I'll focus on what has been the impact at the operational level. As Kate said, perhaps there haven't been many prosecutions, but these laws and policies have actually had a very profound impact at the operational level. We've identified in the report 5 broad areas. The first one has been in terms of funding. We found that legislation has actually directly affected the levels of humanitarian funding. This has been particularly for Islamic organizations, which have come, under greater scrutiny, especially after 9/11. Private donors have become, very concerned of the consequences of indirectly supporting designated groups of individuals, and have therefore, stopped supporting a number of Islamic humanitarian organizations. We've seen that this has had a particular impact on local NGOs. For instance, there have been sponsorship schemes for orphans in Gaza. They've had to stop altogether because they were supported through the donations of citizens, in the Gulf, which have come to a complete halt. And perhaps Jehangir will say more about it later. The impact is, however, not restricted to Islamic organizations. It has had an important impact, on the humanitarian organizations at large. Until recently, I think there's been, a level of tolerance of aid diversion, has been considered as the cost of doing business in very volatile, risky environments. However, this risk in particular context is no longer tolerated, irrespective of the level of need. It's important to stress that it's almost impossible to eliminate all risk of aid diversion in certain environments, but this is what humanitarian organizations are asked to do today. Now, you can imagine that in areas like South Central Somalia is quite difficult to eliminate, with beyond any reasonable doubt, all risk that, there could be some misappropriation of aid. However, if these assurances are not provided, funding, has been stopped, and that is we've got examples in the paper from Gaza and from Somalia. The second area where there has been quite a significant impact has been on the substantial increase of administrative procedures, the administrative burden that counter-terrorism legislation has generated, which has obviously affected the timeliness and effectiveness of humanitarian action. More importantly, it's also deterred, I would say, aid actors from operating in some high-risk areas. Now, once again, Islamic NGOs have come under really, tremendous sort of pressure and experience difficulties in transferring monies, including donations from Western governments, both bilateral and multilateral donors, to their country offices. They experience significant delays. Banks can ask for an investigation of up to 3 months and hold the funds for 3 months without any explanation. And the organization are asked to bear the cost of the investigation as well, even when they are cleared of any wrongdoing. In addition to that, there is actually, this was something that non-Islamic humanitarian organizations did not report, to us in the interviews as an area, of concern. It was not a problem for non-Islamic organizations. But there are other, sort of administrative procedures that are of concern to both. This is particularly the amount of, requirements that have been introduced, vetting procedures, collection of information. The organizations now have to provide to donors to satisfy their requirements, which entail an enormous investment in terms of staff resources and also financial resources, of course. Donor regulations require the organizations vet staff of partners, and even of partners of partners. So imagine what it takes to do all of that. We've heard in the interviews of how many extra staff organizations have had to hire in places like Gaza and even at headquarters to collect and monitor all this information, and also to ensure legal compliance with donor regulations. Now, I want to stress that all humanitarian organizations we have spoken to during the study consider risk mitigation measures important. And as Kate said, they've always put risk mitigation measures in place. However, many feel that they've become too cumbersome, and they're preventing humanitarian organizations from taking the necessary risks to assist communities in need. And they're also, obviously affecting their capacity to respond to crises in a timely manner. And we've seen the results of that in Somalia. I'll say more about this in a minute. The third area of impact has been on the relations with local communities and how this has been really undermined by the kind of vetting requirements that have been put in place, particularly by the US government. USAID partner vetting procedures requirements require that you collect and report personal information about partner and contractor staff to the US government. Needless to say, this is seen by partners on the ground as a very invasive and accusatory action. Other donors have also tried to introduce similar clauses in funding contracts, require recipients to disclose personal information or on partner organizations and beneficiaries. These are measures that profoundly undermine the neutrality of humanitarian organizations and, of course, make acceptance really difficult to achieve. As a consequence, this can actually potentially compromise access to people in need. Also, during the study, we heard how compliance with U.S. legislation is seen by some partners as basically endorsing the political view of the government. So what we've seen today, it's very difficult for humanitarian organizations, as Mike was saying, funded by specific donor, to resist some of these measures. Organizations, for instance, such as MSF, that has large independent funding, have either refused to accept these clauses or replaced them with more general clauses, or they've inserted additional text stressing that nothing in donor agreements could prevent the organization from fulfilling its mission as an impartial humanitarian actor, in the case of MSF, bound by medical ethics. However, how many organizations can do that, we can leave for the debate later on. The fourth area of impact has been, on actually leading organizations to be less transparent. What we've heard during the report is that, for instance, in Gaza, in cluster meetings are not being minuted because people, of course, are concerned, that there could be an acknowledgement of some engagement with proscribed organization. Hamas is a proscribed organization. We've also heard of donor policy advice being requested and not being given, or in the case of one donor, given on non-headed paper. Charitable giving has also become less transparent because concerned citizens have turned to less regulated forms of giving because they were concerned of falling foul of counter-terrorism legislation. So we've seen more cash donations given because of the fear of the monitoring of transactions to and from Islamic humanitarian organizations, given to dubious organizations. One example has been after the Pakistan floods. The UK diaspora gave very large amounts of cash to individuals or small organizations that were not registered with the UK charity commissions and that they were most likely not compliant with counter-terrorism laws. The fifth area has been the area of coordination. Again, the risk of criminalization, the fear of the potential prosecution of staff has actually led many individuals and organizations to be very reluctant to discuss these issues, let alone find a coordinated position about them, about how to engage with the donors. It's the sheer sharing of information and how each organization is positioning itself around these issues that's become very problematic. This, of course, runs counter to all the efforts that have been promoted through UN humanitarian reform, which the donors hold so dear. We see that partners are reluctant to share information at cluster meeting, in other coordination fora, and of course this reluctance is common also amongst donors, where until recently a policy of don't ask, don't tell has prevailed. There have been some initiatives to try and document the impact of counter-terrorism legislation. Some have been led by the ISC, the Interagency Standing Committee. Some have been promoted by individual organizations, but the uptake to date has been very little, again, because of the concern the organizations have. I'll say a few words about the Somalia situation. There are two case studies in the report. One is Gaza, one is Somalia. It's actually quite a lot of learning from Gaza, but we could perhaps discuss later. But because of the currency of the crisis, let me say a few things about Somalia. I want to stress that counter-terrorism laws have affected humanitarian organizations globally, but it is in Gaza and Somalia that the effects have been most felt. I won't go in detail about the sanctions regime that exists in Somalia. I'll just say that in 2008, Al-Shabaab was proscribed, was put on a designated list by the UN Security Council together with 10 individual organizations. In 2010, a humanitarian exemption was introduced by the UN Security Council. However, this exemption was only for UN agencies and its partners, so did not include other organizations, for instance, like MSF or the ICRC, and was not mandatory, which meant that member states were not obliged to receive it in domestic law, and the US did not receive the exemption, did not incorporate the exemption into their domestic law. So what we have seen since 2008 has been a massive decline in funding. The funding to Somalia is almost halved, particularly as a result of the drop in US contributions. In addition, humanitarian organizations have been asked to introduce a massive array of risk mitigation measures. There's a detailed list in the policy brief, so I won't go in detail. Now, these are requirements that have by far exceeded what is considered acceptable in many other contexts, have by far exceeded what is considered acceptable in Afghanistan, for instance. And again, we can have a discussion about this later, when we open the Q&A. Now, if you combine, the hostility of Al-Shabaab towards aid agencies, the volatility, the insecurity of the environment in South Central Somalia, and you add, the impact of the counter-terrorism measures and what they require in terms of risk management procedures and so forth, this has all led to a progressive deterioration in humanitarian access since 2008. Humanitarian organizations have become increasingly less able to operate in Al-Shabaab-controlled areas. And despite the array of risk mitigating measures that have been put in place, funding has remained low. Now, even the organizations with funding have found it very difficult to operate swiftly and timely in the crisis because, again, they had to respond to all the pre-vetting checks and the other risk mitigating procedures that had been put in place. They had to comply largely with OFAC regulations, and so they could not move fast enough. And this has been an issue in the crisis, has inevitably slowed down the response. The current famine has placed these restrictions in the spotlight, and what we have seen is that, donors have been forced to relax their requirements. So OFAC restrictions have been eased, and we've seen that over the summer, licenses have been granted to the State Department, to USAID, partners and contractors to operate in Somalia. I rely more on the note because I want to say this accurately. OFAC has also announced that non-USAID partners could operate in Somalia without a license, and that, and I quote, incidental benefits to Al-Shabaab, i.e. food and medicine that might fall into their hands, are not the focus for OFAC sanctions enforcement. Now, this is an announcement is rather ambiguous and has created, perhaps even more confusion, because even if the fact that incidental benefits to Al-Shabaab are not the focus of OFAC sanctions enforcement, this is neither a guarantee that OFAC will not take action in the future, nor does it bar prosecution under US criminal law in relation to the material support statute that Kate talked about. So the net result has been that humanitarian organizations have remained very cautious despite the current conditions in South Central Somalia. Let me just conclude. I am concluding, sorry, and very rapidly. It's a topic that I find very difficult, to be succinct because you need the detail. But I'll just conclude rapidly saying that obviously, the application of counter-terrorism legislation to humanitarian operations is challenging principled humanitarian action. This is clear, and is, the point is made very clearly, I hope, in the report. Now, preventing material support to terrorist acts is an important objective, and is an objective with which humanitarian actors don't, the humanitarian actors don't disregard in principle. However, the steps that many states are taking to achieve this objective are creating an unnecessary adverse impact on efforts to provide life-saving assistance to victims of conflict. What is needed, we feel, and we argue strongly in the report, is some more open and transparent dialogues between humanitarian organizations and donor governments. And when I talk about donor governments, I don't talk about the aid departments of donor government, which are perhaps more sympathetic, to the concern of humanitarian organizations. But I talk about the finance, treasury, home, treasury, justice departments that actually hold the upper hand on these issues. And finally, just to say that it's important for humanitarian organizations to also share this information and be more transparent amongst themselves. This is equally important. And I'll stop here.
Thanks very much indeed. No, thank you, Sarah. And two very comprehensive presentations. Thank you.